Ohio. You see what's happening. Would you like to have that happen to you?
Today, we are working 24/7 to help provide U.S. citizens in Lebanon with as many options as possible to depart. Our goal is to provide as many options as we can to make sure all of them are safe.
Our thoughts and prayers continue to go out to the families of those that have just experienced this heartbreak.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Former President Trump is rallying near Saginaw, Michigan today, speaking for the first time since the judge in his federal election interference case unsealed special counsel's 165-page filing, making new assertions in that case. Trump is in Saginaw County. He won that in 2016, but lost it in 2020. On the Democratic side, Vice President Kamala Harris is in Ripon, Wisconsin. For those who keep track of such things, Ripon is the birthplace of the modern Republican Party. Joining the vice president today in that storied location, former Republican Congresswoman and member of the House GOP leadership at one point, Liz Cheney. Cheney has very recently been a very vocal critic of former President Trump and memorably served on the January 6th Congressional Committee. We start tonight with Nancy Cordes and Robert Costa. Nancy is following Harris in Wisconsin, Robert following Trump in Michigan. Nancy, we'll start with you. It is important to note for the vice president, you can't spend all of your time in Pennsylvania. You must seek votes elsewhere. What is the feel in Wisconsin and the import of Liz Cheney being there?
The import is, Major, that in a race that is this close in battleground states like Wisconsin, like Pennsylvania, if the Harris campaign can successfully pick off even a sliver of Republican voters, that would be enough to help tip the scales. And so they have been trying to emphasize all of the current and former Republican officials, both from the national level to the state level to the local level, who once supported Donald Trump and don't anymore, particularly those officials who are willing to go that extra step like Liz Cheney and actually endorse Kamala Harris for president. So, yes, about a month ago, Liz Cheney said that she was going to vote for Kamala Harris. Yes, she has spent years criticizing Donald Trump, but the fact that she's appearing here in a short while on the stage behind me with Harris is something that the Harris campaign hopes will give permission to, even just a tiny fraction of Republican voters to go ahead and pull the lever for Harris this time. In fact, I spoke a short time ago, Major, to a 20-year sheriff in a nearby county. He's from Iowa County, Wisconsin. His name is Steve Mishek, and he supported Trump back in 2016, but he told me this time around he's going for Harris. Take a listen to why he says he's doing that.
This time, I think it's even more important to vote for the Democratic candidate because there's just so much of a difference between the two candidates, in my opinion.
He told me, Major, that what really concerned him during the Trump years was the steady stream of Trump officials who either got kicked out or left on their own accord, who broke with Donald Trump. He said he felt that that was chaotic. And he said even in his sheriff's office, he wouldn't be able to function if there were new staffers coming and going all the time.
Nancy Cordes, stay with us. Robert Costa, I want to bring you in. Give us a sense of the Trump campaign today and reaction and the impact it believes Jack Smith's most recent filing will have on the trajectory of their campaign and the conversation around it.
Major, great to be with you and Nancy. Behind me is the State University in Saginaw, Michigan. We're here a little bit north of Detroit, Michigan. Just saw former President Donald Trump address a few thousand people in the basketball arena here. The January 6th case, Jack Smith, didn't really come up at all during the case of his remarks. You had former President Donald Trump instead focusing on the economy, talking about border security, talking about Vice President Kamala Harris in a very negative way, called her a liar, said she was not ready for the presidency, mocking Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, praising his own running mate, J.D. Vance. But you don't see from Trump, at least today, that veering into the January 6th issue, trying to litigate it in the public sphere. That's an example of how the Trump campaign believes that to win these battleground states, it's not going to be fueled by grievance over January 6th, but grievance over the economy among independent, conservative, Republican voters.
And Robert, when the president spoke today, it was an interesting dynamic. He talked about Springfield, said, do you want to have this come to you? And the audience booed and said, no, no, no. Kind of a call and response that you've seen at many Trump rallies, and so have I. But it's indicative of what happens oftentimes. There's a narrative that the Trump campaign creates, whether it's true or not, and there are plenty of Republicans in Ohio that say whatever they've said about Springfield, Ohio isn't true, but the audience believes it. Audience has already come up with a fully embraced notion of what the former president is talking to them about and answers right back to him.
Major, your observation is spot on that these issues are being part of the conversation at a national level. But what's intriguing to me as a reporter that here on the ground, whether it's in Michigan or other battleground states, this election isn't being discussed at a granular level by voters. They're not talking about whether Trump is right in his comments on Springfield, Ohio, or what Senator Vance said at a debate. So many voters, especially the Trump supporters I've met, this comes down to they want Trump back. They want Trump back in the White House. They think the country was better under Trump. They have a cultural, economic, political, a fervent connection with Trump. And it really is a basic choice for them. They don't like how they feel under Biden-Harris. They want Trump-Vance as a kind of return to the past, back to the future type choice. And for the Harris campaign, this is complicated because Trump is just stirring up his base, trying to get people who feel a little bit of economic pain to say, why not give Trump another shot? And it's just interesting how so much of the stuff that makes its way to the debate stage, whether it's VP or presidential, doesn't often migrate into these more kitchen table conversations. It's really about, do you like Trump or do you like Harris, for so many of these voters I've met.
Exactly. Robert, thank you. Nancy, I want to ask you a couple of things. How does the Harris campaign, based on your conversations with it, feel about Wisconsin and the polling there? And you know as well as I do, nothing is accidental at this stage of a presidential campaign. The Harris campaign must have some data that suggests appearing with Liz Cheney, not just invoking her name, but having her actually at an event like this has some added value.
It does, because remember, it's not just about Liz Cheney. It is also about her father, the former vice president of the United States, Dick Cheney. There are Republicans out there who still admire Dick Cheney, who still feel allegiance to him. And so it's kind of a 2-for-1 situation as far as the Harris campaign is concerned. Not only do they remind voters, Republican voters, that Liz Cheney is on their side, but they remind voters that now Vice President Cheney, and keep in mind, Vice President Cheney and Liz Cheney are extremely conservative. Liz Cheney, as you recall from covering her on Capitol Hill, she was a deeply conservative Republican. She simply broke with Donald Trump and with the party over Trump's behavior before January 6th and certainly during January 6th as well. And so I anticipate that here in Ripon, we will hear her make the case that Donald Trump is not a true conservative, that he is not a true Republican, that a lot of his positions veer from conservative orthodoxy, and that a vote against him is not a betrayal of the Republican Party. In fact, it's a way to turn the page and return to the values that Republicans like her and like her father have supported for generations.
And Robert, very quickly on this Cheney dynamic, I'm sure the Trump campaign would say, go ahead, Liz Cheney, go ahead, Dick Cheney. Former President Trump is remaking the Republican Party, and it's your fault for not recognizing the new Republican Party he's creating.
And the Cheney issue is now bigger than just the question of whether traditional Republicans are going to give Vice President Harris a shot. This comes right after Special Counsel Jack Smith's filing about his January 6th case. So for the Harris campaign, it's potentially optimal timing if they want to hammer that message on conduct and character related to former President Trump before and after January 6th. Cheney will help underscore that with her appearance with the vice president. At the same time, I've known Congresswoman Cheney for a long time, covered her, interviewed her, and we all know her role on January 6th, but she's also a traditional hawk when it comes to foreign policy. So for those Republicans who have an aversion to how Senator Vance and Trump have articulated their positions on foreign policy, especially on Ukraine, she could be there as someone who says, hey, even if you don't like the Democrats on abortion rights, if you don't like the Democrats on taxes, give him a chance on foreign policy. And in this election, every vote matters. And so it might be a handful of votes here or there, but that handful could be important in certain states.
Could be decisive indeed. On the road for us, Nancy Cordes and Robert Costa. As always, we thank you. The union representing hundreds of thousands of firefighters and emergency responders will not make a presidential endorsement this campaign. The International Association of Firefighters, its president, said today in a statement, quote, "This decision, which we took very seriously, is the best way to preserve and strengthen our unity." The union was one of the first to back then candidate Joe Biden in 2019. Just a few weeks ago, you might recall, the Teamsters also decided not to endorse in this year's election. The new details about former President Trump's alleged criminal scheme to stay in power after losing the 2020 election. We will take a look at the emerging case against the former president. That's next. You are streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Federal Judge Tanya Chutkan is allowing former President Trump more time to respond to Jack Smith's unsealed filing, which was such a big part of our conversation here yesterday. Former president has until November 7th to respond. That's, of course, just 2 days after Election Day. In Smith's 165-page document, the special counsel attempts to make the case that Trump's actions were as a private citizen, not a sitting president, and therefore not shielded by immunity provided to the president and the presidency in a recent Supreme Court decision. One of the allegations made in that filing is that the former president replied by saying, quote, "So what?" when informed that his vice president, Mike Pence, could quite probably be in danger inside the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. David Becker joins me now here at the table. He is CBS News election law contributor and the executive director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, and, importantly, my co-author on this very fine book, The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. David, great to see you. So I want to, for the audience's benefit, read something that from the very early part of Jack Smith's filing. Quote, "His scheme was fundamentally a private one. Working with a team of private co-conspirators, the defendant, that means former President Trump, acted as a candidate when he pursued multiple criminal means to disrupt, through fraud and deceit, the government function by which votes are collected and counted." Listen to this. "A function in which the defendant, as president, had no official role." That puts it into a nice little nutshell, does it not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you haven't read it, it's a good read. Read the 165-page motion. What they're talking about there is that the president, as the chief executive of the United States, has actually no role in elections and certainly no role in a presidential election in which he's a candidate. There's no role for the president to oversee electoral votes. In fact, the Constitution expressly gives that to the vice president, not the president himself. And
the Constitution gives to the states the authority to conduct its elections and be the certifying agent in communication with the Congress and the National Archives.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so when you look at the president's actions at the time, former President Trump, what he's doing is he's engaging often with campaign staff or private staff, counsel like Rudy Giuliani, Cleta Mitchell, Sidney Powell, who had no role in the White House, who were campaign staff, or in some cases, even in the case of Sidney Powell, had no relation to the campaign either, who were just private citizens. And in that kind of role, they were serving his role as office seeker, not office holder, and they make that distinction.
And as you read the special counsel's filing, it also sheds light on this assertion that has been made with some frequency by those who defend former President Trump's actions. He was merely asking questions, inquiring on behalf of the country writ large about how well this election was conducted. That's not what the filing says.
No, the filing is very, very clear that he was trying to use his role as office holder, as the president, to kind of bully states to serve him as office seeker as a presidential candidate. And it's really remarkable when you look at all of the things he was saying and doing. It tells a very, very disturbing timeline from even pre-election, where he was setting the stage to claim the election was stolen as early as the summer of 2020. And what's somewhat chilling is seeing how much some of those claims echo what he's saying right now and in the earlier months of the 2024 campaign.
David, speaking about right now, There's a woman in Colorado named Tina Peters who was sentenced today. Explain to the audience who Tina Peters is and how her case highlights or illustrates some of the things that were asserted about the 2020 election and have been tested in court, and now a verdict has been rendered against a woman like Tina Peters who brought those accusations.
So in the thousands of election jurisdictions in our country and the hundreds of thousands of professional election workers in our country, it's remarkable that amidst all the pressure and lies about the 2020 election, only a tiny handful of them succumbed to those lies and engaged in some of the distortion of our legitimate election process. Tina Peters is one of those people. Tina Peters is a clerk in the western part of Colorado in Mesa County who succumbed to the disinformation, who saw an opportunity to gain fame amongst a certain group of people who also were disappointed in the election, and who importantly gave unauthorized and illegal access to voting machines and equipment to people like Mike Lindell and his supporters in the aftermath of the 2020 election. She was found guilty in a Colorado state court in Mesa County, Colorado. She was prosecuted by Republican district attorneys there, and her sentencing just happened today. And she was, after a long sentencing hearing where she was given about 45 minutes to just openly speak to the court, she was given 9 years of imprisonment, which most of us who have been watching this thought was entirely appropriate, given her unusual behavior and the way she embraced her role flying on private jets with Mike Lindell and others in the course of the aftermath of the 2020 election.
Very quickly, David, the storm, Helene, North Carolina, Georgia, what impact, if any, will it have on the ability of voters to participate, have their votes cast and counted?
Well, particularly in North Carolina, they're still assessing it. It's about 24 counties in the western part of the state. They're still trying to dig out from the flooding and everything that's happening. They think they're going to have a good idea of that later this week. But election officials have dealt with these kinds of things before, although Helene was particularly rough on western North Carolina. They've got some time to fix this. They'll likely consolidate some precincts for people who lost their mail ballots or need a duplicate ballot. They'll get a new one. That means their other ballot will be invalidated. Every voter only gets one valid ballot at any given point in time. Both North Carolina and Georgia have established websites for people who want information that are specific to the devastation related to Hurricane Helene. So election officials are on top of this. It's going to be particularly hard for North Carolina, but I have a lot of confidence in those folks.
Key phrase, election officials are on top of this, as they always are. David Becker, thank you very much.
Thank you, Major.
The Justice Department is preparing for any foreign interference ahead of the presidential election. CBS Evening News anchor Norah O'Donnell sat down with Matthew Olson. He is the senior Department of Justice official policing threats in this election space. Here is part of that conversation.
Donald Trump has long claimed that Russian interference is a hoax, in his word. Has that had an impact on the Department of Justice's public perception of what you're doing?
First, 2016, Russian interference in the election was not a hoax. It was actually happening then. It is actually happening now. There is no question about it. Our leadership, from the Attorney General to the FBI Director to the Director of National Intelligence, have been very clear about Russia's efforts to interfere in our elections and the fact that it is more aggressive than ever this election cycle. So it is happening, and it is happening with increasing frequency as we approach the election now just over a month away.
As Israel strikes Beirut and quite probably prepares for its next move against Iran. The latest from the region, that is next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Good to have you with us. President Biden said, quote, nothing is going to happen today. That was when he was asked about Israel's intentions, whether or not to retaliate against Iran. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made it clear Tehran will pay in some measure for its widespread missile attack earlier this week on Israel. This as the region braces for that response. Our MTS Tayeb is in Beirut following all the developments.
Well, Israel's airstrikes across Lebanon have only been intensifying. There have been massive strikes across southern Lebanon, eastern Lebanon, and here in the capital, Beirut. In the southern suburb, which is known as Dahya, there has been a number of strikes. Now, this is an area which is often described as the seat of Hezbollah's power. It's where Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, was assassinated nearly a week ago today. We we were taken to Hezbollah on a tour by Hezbollah media officials who showed us around the neighborhood. And what we saw was an area which was once packed full of people, home to hundreds of thousands, now essentially a ghost town. And we saw the aftermath of several Israeli strikes. Some of those buildings reduced to complete rubble and only leaving behind these massive, still smoking craters. Now, all of this comes at a time in which there's growing concern that Israel's campaign here in Lebanon is only going to widen. Tonight, Israel has issued evacuation orders in southern Lebanon, urging residents to leave those areas. And that's really stoking fears its military will move from limited ground incursions to a full-scale invasion and potentially occupy large areas. The last time Israel occupied southern Lebanon, it lasted for 18 years. Major.
MTS Tayeb, thank you. Former President Trump has on more than one occasion taken credit for overturning Roe versus Wade. Why a new video from Melania Trump may have her at odds with her husband, the former president. What Melania had to say on that topic next, right here on America Decides.
Judge Gorsuch has outstanding legal skills, a brilliant mind, tremendous discipline. Judge Kavanaugh has impeccable credentials, unsurpassed qualifications, and a proven commitment to equal justice under the law. She is a woman of unparalleled achievement, towering intellect, sterling credentials, and unyielding loyalty to the Constitution.
Welcome back to America Decides. The three justices appointed by former President Trump, did it when he was president, to the Supreme Court, played, history will record, a major role in overturning Roe versus Wade. Interestingly, former First Lady Melania Trump today expressed what can only be described as her unequivocal support for abortion rights. Listen.
There is no room for compromise when it comes to this essential right that all women possess from birth. Individual freedom. What does my body, my choice really mean?
I'm going to file that under, I want to bring in our political panel, Dave Weigel and Sabrina Rodriguez. Dave is a politics reporter for Semaphore. Sabrina, national politics reporter for The Washington Post. Dave, this has been an interesting week for Republicans and the self-described, this is their terminology, pro-life movement within it. J.D. Vance says at the debate, Republicans have to do a much better job earning trust. While he is saying that, somewhat kind of flail around the difficulties of the underlying specifics of access to reproductive health care, Trump posts on social media, I would veto a national abortion ban. Now we have Melania Trump putting further distance around this question that the pro-life movement not only considers sacrosanct and decided, but essential to their mobilization. Sum all that up for us, if you could.
There's a long-running Trump strategy here of just not admitting something if it's a problem, not admitting something if it's a personal problem, if it's a legal problem, whatever it is. And I'm reminded of what they did with Project 2025, which exists, which has people from the Trump administration working on it, denying until people start to, if you're in the Trump camp, believe, well, he says it's false, it must be false. That's what they've done. Now, has Trump ever said I'd sign a national abortion ban? No. Has he talked about the specific things his administration would do, who it'd appoint, what it would do? He hasn't talked about that. They've just tried to move the conversation. They're actually pretty comfortable saying we won't do a national ban, even though Vance did say when he's running for Senate they supported one, because when their base hears that, when the voter who's maybe with him on everything but abortion hears that, it's enough to say, well, I trust him. He didn't do it before. He won't do it now.
Sabrina, how would you sum up this week on this particular issue and how Democrats view the week that is nearly over?
I mean, this is just the latest example of Republicans trying to muddy the waters on this issue, on abortion. I mean, looking at the debate, what was the takeaway from what we heard from J.D. Vance? You know, it was him expressing this sympathy, him expressing that he learned a lot from the Ohio referendum that restored abortion rights, him talking about, you know, that there needed to be something that Republicans learned from this, that they've been losing on this issue. But then at the same time, he, as Dave mentioned, has supported in the past a federal abortion ban. And this is just what we've seen from Trump as well. Him at one point expressing he might support a referendum going on in Florida, his now home state, and then later on saying that, of course, he would not vote for it. So this is really, when you look at the undecided voter, that voter in the middle that is just tuning into the election, this is the kind of messaging that puts them in a position of not really knowing where Republicans stand on it. And for that person who maybe it's not the number one issue that they're voting on, but feel maybe a little bit uncomfortable with, an abortion ban, this gives them permission to say, well, they're not going to sign a national abortion ban, or I'm not totally clear. And that's where Democrats are really frustrated right now. And we're hearing them say, like, do not listen to this rhetoric and think that this suddenly means that their agenda is different. And they're really trying to bring home, no, this is the agenda that Republicans have stood for. This is the former president who was responsible for the overturning of Roe versus Wade.
I like your assessment on this. This will be the first presidential election since Roe was overturned. It seems to me that's the biggest X factor. We can't know what it means until we see it. Would you agree with that?
Yes, we've only had a couple elections since then. We've had state elections.
Some special elections, some referenda, but we haven't had a national verdict on this.
Right. And each time we've had female voters who might have sat out or been Republican in the past or not voted in special elections, they voted Democratic. And
underpolled oftentimes.
Underpolled, and that is part of the Harris strategy, as far as I understand it. Yes, are they going to lose some, not just white union workers and working class voters that Biden won? Of all races, they'll probably lose some of that. Will they pick up more women? That's something that sends Democrats' ears ringing because they heard that in 2016. It wasn't true. But in the first election, after Dobbs, they do think it's true. It's been showing up in other elections. There are suburban women in Bucks County and in Maricopa County who have not voted Democratic before, but they're going to vote for the referendum in Arizona, and they're gettable for Harris if that's the issue. Because I'm thinking of some of these states, Arizona being one where it matters. Not only is that their referendum there, but every election, it's saying that we're going to throw this back to the states. If you live in a state that's gettable for Republicans at any point, like Arizona, if you live in Michigan, if you live in those places, it is an active issue in each election. We've never had a race like that before.
Sabrina, your assessment? Is it an X factor? Is it the X factor in this race?
I don't know that it goes so far to say the X factor. I think that at the end of the day, the voters can hold multiple issues at the same time. And we talk to folks every day that tell us, abortion's on the list of issues that they care about. But I think it is one that Democrats know that is ultimately going to help deliver for them in the election. I think the day after the election, we'll be having conversations about the turnout amongst young voters, the turnout amongst women, specifically, as Dave mentions, women, suburban women. And this will be one of those issues that drove them, especially in the states where we've already seen movement on abortion bans, or where we're already seeing, ballot initiatives where people will get to go out not just to vote for president, not just to vote for down ballot, but will actually get to vote over the future of abortion rights in their state.
I want to play you some sound from the former president in Saginaw, Michigan today. And it highlights something that his vice presidential nominee had a very hard time with at the end of the debate. Let's listen.
We did great in 2016. A lot of people don't know. We did much better in 2020. We won. We did win. It was a rigged election. You have to tell Kamala Harris, that's why I'm doing it again. If I thought I lost, I wouldn't be doing this again. You know where I'd be right now? On the beaches of Monte Carlo.
He didn't win in 2020. And Jack Smith's filing also illustrates that in a conversation after being told he lost, Vice President Pence said, you should concede or take a bow and think about 2024, to which then President Trump says, that's such a long way away. He lost. Right. And he still can't come to grips with that. His supporters don't want to come to grips with that. And I use that term grip in a very specific way. He and the Trumpian Republican Party remain in thrall of this lie.
Right, and the way Democrats used it, you saw Tim Wells use it, is whatever else you think of him, whatever his promises are, this is the guy who on the way out of office broke the law, and what other laws would he break? How else would he affect your life if he's untrammeled, if he has advisors who are going to do whatever he says? The one thing I heard from Democrats after the debate, because they got more satisfied with Walz's performance, not just as the night went on, but in the day after, was it would have been nice if he'd brought that up first. You'll see CBS's moderators decided to go after the new news in Israel first. If they had asked that question first, if Walz had brought it up, I'm only here because the last guy who had your job didn't want to break the law, would it have been more effective? But they're getting some earned media, and they're happy to talk about this because there are a lot of voters. We talked about Dobbs. There are a lot of voters where if it's not the single issue, it is enough to say, I like some things about Trump. I do not want that back in the Oval Office. I want to vote Republican down the ballot. I want to vote Republican in the future. I don't want 4 years of who knows what he'll do because of this January 6th experience.
Dave Weigel, you'll have to get the last word on this. Dave Weigel, Sabrina Rodriguez, thank you very much for your time. President Biden is in Florida and Georgia today getting a first-hand look at her damage from Hurricane Helene. Up next, we'll hear from a reporter whose community in far western North Carolina was ravaged by that storm. That's next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. As we mentioned before our last break, President Biden went to Florida and Georgia today to survey the widespread damage from Hurricane Helene. The storm so far has killed more than 200. Many more remain unaccounted for and has inflicted immense devastation across the Southeast after making landfall last week. Our next guest, well, it's fair to say he's an eyewitness and a survivor of the impact of Helene. Chris Moody is a lecturer in journalism at Appalachian State University in North Carolina. Chris, it's good to see you. First of all, tell our audience how you are, what you witnessed, and what the condition of your community currently is.
Well, thankfully, I personally am safe, but many, many others are not. Their homes are destroyed. Their properties are going to take years to get back together. And the community, in terms specifically of the infrastructure, is going to be a long road ahead. This area is high up in the mountains. It's a place that obviously is not used to having big hurricanes or storms coming through it in that way. And it knocked out key parts of the infrastructure in the region, particularly roads and bridges, where many times in this mountain community, there's water that comes underneath those roads and bridges, of course, and they just completely took many of them out. There were hundreds of roads that were closed in the aftermath of this storm, making it incredibly difficult, obviously, to get life back on track, but also to get emergency vehicles to rural areas and offer aid and help in ways that it might be easier in less remote regions. And so there's a real sticky problem ahead, but the good people of Western North Carolina are working together. Both public and private investment is being made in making sure people are safe and making sure that we can get our communities back together.
Chris, you have an article in The Atlantic that describes how the community hasn't really had the luxury of expecting people to come there to assist them. They've had to take up all manner of tasks. What's the hierarchy of needs at the moment?
Well, the first thing that people checked on each other was to make sure they were alive and safe. Then was fresh water and food. Many people lost electricity, and many of these people in this area, their homes are on wells, and you can't get water running in your home without electricity. So there are still people that are filling up jugs and buckets of water and sharing those. And then after clean water, it's just making sure that people can get their electricity and then also get access to grocery stores. If you can't drive to a grocery store because there's a giant cavern in there, a chasm in the middle of the road, it's a real problem. So it's a matter of identifying who needs the access to that food and how we can get it to them as soon as possible. I'm currently in Tennessee gathering supplies and will be driving back home later this week to deliver everything that we possibly can.
You paint in the article a picture of a remote place. Is it so remote that it is, as we speak now, still untouched by either state or federal intervention?
Well, there are probably some places that haven't had the kind of intervention you might think of, maybe like an emergency vehicle being able to get to them. But I assure you that communities have been able to identify people in need and have gotten to them, whether it might not be by a vehicle or a boat, but it was probably by foot. In our neighborhood, in the immediate aftermath of this storm, there were giant holes in the road that you could not get a vehicle over. And then on the other side of the road, it's blocked by trees. And so some communities, including my own home, was blocked in on both sides. Well, people scrambled down into those holes and scrambled back up and were delivering food back and forth and visiting their families. In the immediate aftermath of that storm, you could hear the sound of chainsaws and tractors and four-wheelers, people coming to the aid of one another. It is so remote that you couldn't expect an emergency vehicle to come to your rescue, but you could expect your neighbors to knock on your door and check on you, and that is exactly what people did.
And Chris, I'm not sure this would necessarily be a conversation in this immediate period afterwards, but you mentioned at the top that it's not a region that accustoms itself to being hit this hard by a hurricane that has landfall near Tampa. Has that changed the arc of conversation about weather, how to prepare, how to try to adapt in a place that you're in is it Boone, North Carolina? Is that correct?
I'm in Boone, North Carolina, and then Asheville, just south of us, was hit very hard as well. This is a region that people have talked about as being kind of immune to the extreme effects of climate change. And I think we're going to be rethinking that, as this is just some kind of safe haven that yes, we do have to be prepared. I think there will be major conversations about how we reinforce and build our roads to sustain the future problems like this. And so as we rebuild, that will certainly be part of the equation.
Giving us an eyewitness account, Chris Moody, thank you so very much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Major.
On day one of my new administration, the invasion ends and the deportations begin. We get them out.
Former President Trump has long shared his intentions to engage in mass deportations if he returns to office. How much would that cost? Well, a new report has some staggering figures to illuminate just what those costs might be. That's next. You're streaming America Decides.
We're going to have the largest deportation in the history of our country, and we're going to start with Springfield.
Welcome back to America Decides. If re-elected, former President Trump has pledged to deport millions of people living without documentation, therefore unlawfully in the United States. Yesterday, he went a step further, vowing to revoke temporary protected status for Haitian immigrants living and working legally in Springfield, Ohio. So just think about that, adding those who are here legally to a large number of those here without documentation for potential deportation. A new report says the cost of any mass deportation effort, if enacted, could be catastrophic. That's the word the report uses to our country. According to the American Immigration Council, removing all of the 13.3 million immigrants without legal status in the United States in a one-time operation, if achievable, would cost the federal government at least $315 billion. Mass deportations of this kind could also lead to a loss of as much as 6.8% of the United States' annual gross domestic product, or more than $1 trillion. Adriel Orozco joins us now. He is a senior policy counsel at the American Immigration Council. It's great to have you with us, Adriel. Explain to our audience how you arrived at these numbers, and if these numbers are, from your estimations, on the upward side or the more conservative side.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. And I think it's really important to first highlight the reason why we put out this report. You know, we've been hearing a lot of proposals around mass deportation, but we haven't heard many details. And so we wanted to do is really think about what would this actually look like? What would this actually cost? And what would be its impact for everyday Americans? And so in our report, we have two figures, like you mentioned. So there's an economic impact. And as you mentioned, you know, it could be up to 6.8% of GDP that would shrink. And for context, it's important to note that this is similar. Well, it's 4.2 to 6.8%, which in 2007 and 2009, during the Great Recession, the impact on the economy was 4.3% of GDP shrinking. So this would be possibly higher, on the higher end of our estimate, a bigger impact than the Great Recession. But if we think about the cost, the $315 billion that you mentioned is a one-time, very conservative estimate. And the reason I say it's conservative is because, you know, when we're looking at the one-time costs, we can't really take into account, the real cost of ramping up the massive expansion of our immigration enforcement, immigration court, immigration detention system in order to be able to remove what we calculated around 13 million undocumented or removable immigrants. And so in our report, we actually include another estimate, which is something also that we've heard as a policy proposal in removing 1 million undocumented immigrants per year. And in that cost, where we can actually use comparators to estimate what it would look like to increase detention, to increase courtrooms, to increase ICE personnel, we find that it's actually nearly $1 trillion spread across a little bit over 10 years, or $88 billion per year. So it would be massive to think about the amount of investment the federal government would have to do to actually put something like this into fruition.
And Adriel, looking at the report, it's worth, I think, reminding to our audience that in modern American history, we've never, if I read the report correctly, deported more than 500,000 people per year, and those deportations were principally at the border, not in the interior of the country. Therefore, it would be much harder to get to 1 million, let alone 13 million. I also read in the report that in order to carry out a deportation initiative of this size, you would need, of course, facilities to hold those deportees as they are moving to their home countries, if in fact that's where they go. And the report said 24 times the current deportation capacity would have to be built just to do that. Do I have those figures correct?
Yes, that's correct. So when we think about the current detention capacity, which is around 35 to 40,000 individuals that can be detained on a daily basis, you would have to increase that dramatically in order to be able to detain at least 1 million people for removal. Something that we weren't able to look into as concretely is thinking about things like, who would be the individuals that could be easily identified that ICE actually has check-ins with. However, that would be a small fraction of the individuals that, like you mentioned, ICE would have to go into communities and try to find them. And what we did with our costs is we used the estimates for our particular sub-agency within ICE that actually accounts for the costs of having to go into the community, to have to try to identify individuals who have not had contact with the criminal justice system, so as to be able to have a more accurate idea of what this would truly cost.
And I read also in the report that if we were to add up everyone incarcerated in our country currently, state, local, and federal, that's about 1.9 million people. So when we think about these numbers, 1 million a year in deportations, or maybe 13 million all in one time, we are talking about vastly more numbers than we currently, through all of our systems, state, local, and federal, use to incarcerate those now.
Yes, that's right. So it'd be about a 50% increase. And when you think about it in the context that we live in right now, the United States is one of the most carceral states, countries in the world. And to think about, in the criminal context, that figure, but really trying to expand into the immigration context so broadly, I think that would be really quite tremendous. And so I think it's really important for folks to know, and one thing that we really try to highlight here in this report is that, sometimes people think, oh, mass deportation is really going to only impact the immigrant community. And one thing that we really, really want to highlight here is that this would fundamentally transform all of American society. Imagine seeing ICE officers going into communities across the country. Imagine seeing 24 times the amount of detention centers or space across the country. Like, that would be visible within people's eye view, because there is no way that you can deport such a large population without impacting every single one of us.
Adriel Orozco of the American Immigration Council, we appreciate your time very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
That does it for today. We will be back with another edition of America Decides Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.